Donald Trump insisted he wasn't going to pivot, he wasn't going to change. And he seemed to make that clear by hiring Stephen Bannon, the chairman of the vehemently pro-Trump conservative website Breitbart. But the more immediate impact seemed to come from the tapping of a new campaign manager, veteran pollster Kellyanne Conway, who is popular with reporters and is touting Trump's speech, in which he said he regretted causing anyone personal pain.
But you mentioned anyone who's been personally offended by what he said. Will he reach out to the Khan family personally?
He may, but I certainly hope that they heard him last night. And I certainly hope America heard him last night, because of all the people, David, who have been saying, hey, let's get Trump to pivot, let's get him to be more presidential. That is presidential.
Joining us now from New York, Amy Holmes, political analyst for Rasmussen Reports and a former anchor at The Blaze. In Washington, Heidi Presbella, senior political correspondent for USA Today. And here in Los Angeles, Leslie Marshall, a radio host and Fox News contributor. Heidi, when Manafort stepped down in the wake of the big shakeup, you could see the spin evolve during the day. Talk about spin cycle. At first it was, well, Manafort volunteered to do this. It was his idea. He brought in Kellyanne. He felt like he couldn't budge the candidate. And then other sources were heard from. Explain what happened.
Howie, this just struck me as just another example of Trump being pressured to use what is really a conventional campaign tactic, and then by the end of the day saying, the heck with it. The dignified way for campaign managers or anybody else really on a campaign to leave is for everybody to agree it was voluntary. Trump issues this statement saying we accept his resignation, and then the media moves on. Maybe they write some background stories about people who were disgruntled. But like you said, this was literally evolving minute by minute, and you had Kellyanne, the new campaign manager, essentially confirming that he was asked to leave. So it's not that these things can't be mutually, it's not that these things are mutually exclusive, that both sides could have, agreed mutually to leave. But I think this is an example of what happens when you have really competing interests trying to spin the narrative here. Clearly, Manafort wanted to, preserve his dignity on the way out the door, and Trump didn't want this to be viewed as a hemorrhaging.
You could practically imagine the reporters scrambling to reach more sources, some pro-Manafort, some anti-Manafort, and get some approximation of the truth. So, Amy Holmes, it seems to me that when the shakeup happened, of course, it's a bombshell of a story for the campaign. The pundits immediately reacted by kind of being disdainful, saying it doesn't really matter because Trump is the problem. Was that a bit dismissive?
I think it was, and we've seen since Donald Trump hiring Kellyanne Conway that he has been making this presidential pivot. Ironically, after firing the guy that said it was going to happen, it's happened under Kellyanne becoming the new campaign manager. We'll see if it lasts, and Donald Trump, we know, has been a very volatile candidate, and of course he deserves media scrutiny, but I think he also deserves credit for at least making these initial attempts.
But mostly, I would say, the press was either puzzled by this, Leslie Marshall, or negative toward it. I know you're no Trump fan, but how much of the coverage do you think was influenced by the increasingly hostile tone in the press about Donald Trump and his candidacy?
Well, I think, quite frankly, any time Trump opened his mouth, everybody would cover it because he's good for ratings. And I mean, that's a reality, and that's a real bottom line. I don't think Trump had any disservice. We have to look historically. This is probably the most shakeup we've seen in a presidential campaign, at least in the most current elections in modern day. And I think there was also, there was an additional element. It wasn't just that he was taking a nosedive in the polls and making yet another change in his campaign staff, but there was also the connections with Russia and the Ukraine, and even the question of legality. I heard some historians say back in the day this would be treason and somebody would be hung for this.
So we'll come back to the Manafort question. Let me get Heidi in on this question. So we played it at the top, Trump giving a scripted speech in which he says he regrets some of his past comments. And I think it would be fair to say that most of the press reaction was skeptical. Did he really mean it, or was he being fed these lines?
There was definitely some skepticism, and some of it even bordered on snark. I saw one story that said, well, it wasn't really an apology because he didn't say the word sorry. But at the same time, there are some legitimate reasons for skepticism here. Most of all, this is just not in character for Trump, because he's been asked along the way as he's made these controversial comments if he regrets them, and each time he said no. It also coincides almost perfectly with Kellyanne coming in as his new campaign manager, knowing that she wanted to give him, to soften up his image a bit. So you question whether that's coming legitimately from his heart or from her, from a campaign perspective. That said, he did say the words, and it was a pretty big deal.
Right. Well, Kellyanne Conway said in one of her many interviews this week that Donald Trump went over the speech with a pen, and it wasn't her words. Of course, she's going to say that. Amy, what about the fact that the media, look, let's face it, the media were stunned because Trump never apologizes for anything, although he wasn't specific about which comments and to whom he might be expressing regret.
Right, and Donald Trump himself has said that it's a part of his sort of life strategy to always hit back and always retaliate, never let a charge go unanswered. So for him to now be offering what seemed to be an apology, of course, was newsworthy and newsmaking. But for the press to immediately dismiss it and psychoanalyze Donald Trump, I don't think that that's fair either. And at Rasmussen Reports this week, we released a poll that found that 52% of likely voters think that the media, that Hillary Clinton has got the best media coverage so far in this campaign.
Leslie, the related question here is, we've been through these sort of mini pivots before where Trump gives a couple of scripted speeches. Everyone says, okay, now he's a more disciplined candidate, and it doesn't last. So
Correct.
is the journalistic skepticism on this round justified?
I think it is absolutely justified. When you have someone who says, and just, historically, when you look back, somebody who says, I'm concerned if I've hurt anyone, like you had said, there is, one, no actual specific apology. Two, there are no specifics to who he has offended and what he feels remorseful or, has regret about. And I mean, this is a man that talked about punching Michael Bloomberg in the face. This is a man who cared about himself after the Orlando terrorist attacks and also felt that a man whose son died for this country was attacking him and then attacked the mother who was silent of that.
You can certainly criticize Trump's response to the Khan family, which everybody thinks was a political mistake, but he was denounced by Kaiser Khan at the Democratic Convention. Let me move on and come back to this question about Paul Manafort, who lasted, I guess, about 4 months or so as the Trump campaign manager. The New York Times, Heidi, did this big piece. It was the first of several pieces about his ties as a guy who has been a lobbyist for years to Ukraine, and how ledgers were discovered that seemed to show $12 million in cash being earmarked for Paul Manafort. Manafort vehemently denied that he ever received any of that money. He denounced the New York Times. What'd you make of that story? It didn't prove that he got the payments. Was that story fair?
Yeah, I took a good read over that story again, Howie, and here's my assessment. I think this is a good example where the narrative really kind of makes this story versus the specific facts in this story, because, going into this, we all know that Manafort had ties to big Russian money and to Yanukovych in particular, who is really as corrupt as they come. And so going into that, we kind of had that preformed impression. And then you look at the actual facts. Well, these are handwritten ledgers. It's basically an assertion. It's an assertion from a Ukrainian agency that we're not familiar with, and Manafort could easily deny it. So, even lower down in the story, the investigators had said that there was no proof that he actually received the money. So that kind of brings us back to, why is this news? Well, this is news because of what we knew previously, which is that there is a relationship between these two men that is troubling in and of itself because of who Yanukovych is.
A lot of people in the press jumped to the conclusion, Amy, that it was these stories about the Russian ties and the Ukrainian relationship that sunk Paul Manafort. I'm told by my sources that Donald Trump, while not happy about that distraction, was much more upset with the story we talked about last Sunday, which was big, leaky New York Times piece headlined, "Inside the Failed Mission to Tame Donald Trump's Tongue." His own advisors saying he's not coachable, and perhaps he concluded that Manafort's fingerprints fairly or unfairly were on that piece.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, that Donald Trump did not like having these leaks in the press, that he can't be tamed. But I think getting back to the Russia story, part of also what fueled the media coverage of that is that it dovetailed with the Vladimir Putin-Donald Trump seeming bromance and the kind words that they've had for each other. But if you looked at these articles too, you notice buried way down in the print was that the Podesta group, that's Tony Podesta, the Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's brother, they're also under scrutiny. But looking at the MSM, the mainstream media, you would think that it was only about Paul Manafort.
Right. I just want to close this segment asking you, Leslie, about just the volume, the gusher of anti-Trump stories and headlines compared to those involving Hillary Clinton. Politico, regretful Trump pivots 107 days late. New York Times, and Trump's empire hazy ties, $650 million in debt. Also, GOP worries falling Trump tide will lower all boats. But then there's the Washington Post piece today on the front page with a comfortable lead. Clinton begins laying plans for her White House agenda, almost as if the race were over.
Well, I've said it before. I don't think it's right for any outlet not to be reporting all the facts. That's what a true journalist or journalistic source should do. But I do think, again, that quite frankly, dirt on Donald, anything about Donald, just is more attractive to readers and to viewers and to listeners than information about Hillary Clinton. And so if it bleeds, it leads, or if it has Donald's name in it, it leads.
Right, which of course, if that's true, totally unbalances the coverage. And
Correct.
Before we go to break, let's put up the New York Daily News cover. Supposedly Trump saying, I'm going to lose so good. This piece actually says that his shakeup could be an intentional effort to tank the election in spectacular fashion. Talk about a completely unsupported paroxysm of speculation. All right, let me get a break. You can write to us, mediabuzz@foxnews.com. Let me know what you think on Twitter @HowardKurtz. And when we come back, a closer look at the controversial Breitbart media operation that produced the Trump campaign's new CEO. And later.